What happens when authority is no longer earned, but impersonated? What we call a society where power is claimed through paperwork, not principle, where the illusion of control outweighs the truth of justice. This isn't just a story about a car being booted. It's a story about how fragile our systems are when one person decides to play God with a clipboard and a fake permit. And when the tow truck driver refused to play along, something cracked, not just in the pavement beneath the tires, but in the illusion we all live under. This is a story of HOA Karen and the moment her illusion shattered. I remember the moment I saw the boot on my car, not as a mechanical device, but as a symbol, a declaration, a silent scream of power masquerading as order. It wasn't just metal clamped to rubber. It was a message. You don't belong here. And in that instant, I wasn't just a resident. I was a target, a subject, a name on a list someone had no right to write. The woman who stood beside it, clipboard in hand, sunglasses shielding her eyes from the truth, was known in whispers and eye rolls as Karen. Not a name, but a role, a performance of control, a costume stitched from HOA bylaws and self-appointed righteousness. She didn't work for the city. She didn't work for the HOA. She worked for herself, for the illusion of authority she had built, brick by forged brick, permit by counterfeit seal. And yet, people obeyed her. Why? Because we are conditioned to obey symbols, not truths. We see a vest, a badge, a document, and we kneel. We don't ask questions. We don't challenge. We comply. And in that compliance, we become complicit. I stood there, staring at the boot, feeling the weight of every silent neighbor who had let her reign unchecked. Was it fear? Was it apathy? Or was it something deeper? A belief that someone must be in charge, even if that someone is a fraud? Karen spoke with the cadence of bureaucracy, the tone of someone who had memorized the rhythm of power but not its ethics. You violated Section 3.2, she said, as if the number itself carried divine authority. But I hadn't. There was no violation, no warning, no process, just punishment. And that's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. She needed to feel powerful, and my car was her canvas. The boot was her brushstroke. The clipboard was her scripture. And the permit, the permit was her holy relic. Laminated, stamped, signed, but not by anyone real. I asked to see it. She hesitated. That pause was everything. It was a crack in facade, the moment the illusion flickered. She handed it over, and I felt its weight, not physical, but psychological. It looked official. It used the right fonts. It had the right jargon. But it was wrong. Deeply, unmistakably wrong. The signature was a name I knew didn't exist. The seal was a copy of a copy. The expiration date was smudged. And in that moment, I saw her not as a villain, but as a symptom of a system that rewards performance over principle. She wasn't the disease. She was a fever, the body's desperate attempt to feel in control. I called the tow company. The driver arrived, skeptical but curious. He had seen things, real violations, real permits, real authority. But this was theater. He examined the document, his eyes narrowing, his silence growing louder. This isn't valid, he said, not to me, but to the air, to the idea of justice itself. Karen protested. She invoked codes, threatened escalation, summoned imaginary supervisors. But the driver didn't flinch. He called the police, not to punish, but to clarify, to bring light into the fog. And as we waited, I wondered, how many Karens are out there, wielding fake power, unchecked, unchallenged? How many boots are clamped to lives, not just cars? The officer arrived, calm, methodical. He examined the permit, asked questions, made calls. And slowly, the illusion unraveled. Karen's voice cracked. Her posture shifted. Her sunglasses came off. And beneath them, I saw fear, not of punishment, but of exposure. Because when your power is built on lies, truth is the greatest threat. The officer confirmed it. The permit was fake. The authority was non-existent. The boot was illegal. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the parking lot, but in the neighborhood, in the psyche of every silent witness. Karen was not a queen. She was a pretender. And the tow truck driver? He wasn't just a worker. He was a mirror, reflecting back the truth we had refused to see. We removed the boot, not just from the tire, but from the narrative, from the story she had written in forged ink. And as it clanked to the ground, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt awakening, because illusions only survive in silence. And that day, silence died. They watched from behind curtains, from porches, from the safety of silence. Not one neighbor stepped forward. Not one voice rose in protest. And in that stillness, I saw something more terrifying than Karen's forged authority. I saw complicity. The kind that doesn't wear a badge or carry a clipboard, but that echoes through every unspoken word, every averted gaze, every "not my problem." Because power doesn't just corrupt, it recruits. It seduces the passive, the indifferent, the comfortable. And in this neighborhood, comfort was king. The lawns were trimmed, the driveways swept, the rules obeyed. But beneath that order was rot, a rot born of fear, of convenience, of the quiet belief that as long as the boot isn't on your car, you're safe. I had lived here for years. I knew these people. We shared barbecues, school runs, weather complaints. But when Karen began her reign, booting cars, issuing fake citations, inventing violations, something shifted. People stopped making eye contact. They stopped asking questions. They started nodding, smiling, complying, not because they believed her, but because they feared her, or worse, because they envied her. There's a strange allure to power, even counterfeit power. It creates gravity. And Karen, with her laminated lies and bureaucratic bravado, became a black hole. She pulled people in, not with truth, but with dominance. I remember one neighbor, Tom, who once joked about Karen's boot fetish. He laughed, shrugged, said, "Better her than me." That sentence haunted me. Better her than me. As if injustice is tolerable, even amusing, as long as it's not personal. As if truth is negotiable, conditional, expendable. And that's the sickness. Not Karen's delusion, but the neighborhood's acceptance. Because when lies become routine, truth becomes radical. And radicals are punished, silenced, isolated. I became the pariah, not for breaking rules, but for questioning them, for challenging the illusion, for refusing to kneel. There's a philosophy, Camus, I think, that says rebellion begins with a no. The refusal, a line drawn in sand. But rebellion also requires witnesses. And in this neighborhood, the witnesses were blind by choice. They saw the boot. They saw the tow truck. They saw the police. And still they said nothing. Some even defended her. She's just trying to keep order. She means well. You should have parked differently. These weren't arguments. They were shields. Shields against guilt, against discomfort, against the terrifying possibility that they had been wrong all along, that they had enabled a fraud. The tow truck driver, when he exposed a fake permit, didn't just confront Karen. He confronted the entire ecosystem that allowed her to thrive. And the silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was revealing. It was the sound of a mirror cracking. Because when truth enters a space built on illusion, it doesn't just illuminate, it devastates. People began to whisper, not about Karen, but about themselves, about their own compliance, their own silence, their own cowardice. And that's when I realized Karen wasn't the only one caught. The neighborhood was caught too, caught in a web of comfort, fear, and self-preservation. I walked past houses that day, each one a monument to quiet complicity. I saw children playing, unaware of the lies their parents tolerated. I saw flags waving, symbols of freedom in a place where truth had been booted. And I wondered, what does it take to wake a neighborhood? A scandal? A tragedy? A confrontation? Or something quieter, like a tow truck driver refusing to play along? Maybe that's how revolutions begin, not with marches or speeches, but with small acts of defiance, with someone saying, "This isn't right," and meaning it. Karen was exposed, but the neighborhood remained. And the question lingered, would they change? Would they confront their silence? Or would they find a new Karen, a new illusion, a new comfort? Because systems don't die with one fraud. They adapt, they evolve, they find new faces. And unless we confront the root, the complicity, we're doomed to repeat the cycle. Again and again, boot after boot, lie after lie. That day, I didn't just lose faith in Karen. I lost faith in the idea that truth alone is enough, because truth needs allies. It needs courage. It needs voices. And in this neighborhood, voices were in short supply. He wasn't supposed to care. That's what the system expects of men like him. Tow truck drivers, blue collar, transactional, in and out. He was supposed to arrive, clamp the car, collect a fee, and leave. No questions, no resistance, no conscience. But he didn't follow the script. He paused. He looked. He asked. And in that pause, something radical happened. He chose truth over routine. In a world that rewards speed and silence, he slowed down and spoke. And that choice, small, quiet, almost imperceptible, was revolutionary. Because defiance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "This isn't right," and waits for the echo. He examined the permit like a scholar, not a laborer. His fingers traced the edges. His eyes scanned the fonts, the seals, the signatures. He didn't just see a document. He saw a story, a lie dressed in official language, a performance of legitimacy. And he refused to be its audience. Karen hovered nearby, her voice sharp, her posture rigid. She invoked authority, threatened escalation, tried to drown him in jargon. But he didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply stood, calm, grounded, immovable, like a stone in a storm. And in that stillness, he became something more than a driver. He became a witness, a judge, a mirror. I watched him, stunned, not because he was brave, but because he was human, deeply, unapologetically human. In a system that dehumanizes, that reduces people to roles and tasks, he reclaimed his agency. He chose to care. And that choice disrupted everything. Karen's power depended on compliance, on people doing their jobs without thinking. But he thought, he questioned, he called the police, not to escalate, but to clarify, to verify, to seek truth. And that act, simple as it was, shattered the illusion. Because when one person refuses to play along, the whole game trembles. The officer arrived, and the driver didn't defer. He didn't shrink. He presented the permit, explained the inconsistencies, laid out the facts, not with anger, but with precision, with integrity. And the officer listened, not to Karen's noise, but to the driver's clarity. And in that moment, I saw the power of defiance, not as rebellion, but as responsibility. The driver didn't act out of vengeance or ego. He acted out of principle, out of a quiet belief that truth matters, that justice isn't just a word. It's a practice, a discipline, a choice. Karen faltered. Her voice cracked. Her posture collapsed. Because her power was performative, and performance dies in the face of authenticity. The driver didn't yell. He didn't shame. He simply stood in truth. And truth, when embodied, is louder than any scream. The officer confirmed the permit was fake. The boot was illegal. The act was unjust. And the driver, without ceremony, removed the boot, not as a favor, but as a correction, as a restoration, as a refusal to participate in a lie. I thanked him. He nodded. No speech, no sermon, just a nod. And that nod carried more weight than any lecture. It said, I saw, I knew, I acted. And that's the essence of defiance, not noise but clarity, not chaos but conscience. He drove away, his truck rumbling like a punctuation mark. And I stood there, changed, not because the boot was gone, but because someone had cared enough to remove it. Someone had chosen truth over convenience. Someone had reminded me that systems only survive when we forget our humanity. The tow truck driver wasn't a hero in the cinematic sense. No cape, no spotlight, but he was heroic in the philosophical sense. He embodied the courage to question, the strength to stand, the wisdom to act. And in a world drowning in illusion, That kind of heroism is rare, precious, necessary. He didn't just expose Karen. He exposed the system that allowed her to thrive. And in doing so, he exposed us, all of us who watch, who comply, who stay silent. That day, I learned that defiance isn't about breaking rules. It's about honoring truth. And truth, when honored, breaks illusions. The driver didn't just tow cars. He towed the lie. He dragged it into the light. And in that light, everything changed. He arrived without urgency, without spectacle. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just a quiet presence in a world unraveling. The police officer stepped into the scene not as a savior, but as a mirror, reflecting back the truth we had all tried to ignore. His uniform carried weight, not because of its fabric, but because of what it represented. The final authority in a space polluted by counterfeit power. And yet, even he was cautious. Because in society where illusion often masquerades as law, even truth must tread carefully. Karen greeted him with confidence. She spoke in codes, in citations, in the language of control. She gestured to the permit, to the boot, to the clipboard, as if these objects were talismans of legitimacy. But the officer didn't flinch. He didn't nod. He didn't affirm. He asked questions. Simple, direct, piercing. Who authorized this? Where is the original permit? What department issued this? And with each question, Karen's facade cracked. Her answers stumbled. Her voice wavered. Because truth, when summoned, demands coherence. And lies, no matter how polished, eventually collapse under scrutiny. The officer examined the permit with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't just read it. He dissected it. He called dispatch. He cross-referenced signatures. He checked databases. And slowly, methodically, he built a case. Not against Karen as a person, but against the illusion she had constructed. It wasn't personal. It was structural, philosophical, existential. Because when authority is forged, reality itself is distorted. And the officer, in that moment, became more than a law enforcer. He became an arbiter of reality, a guardian of coherence. I watched him work, and I felt something strange. Hope, not because I believe in the system, but because I saw someone within it refusing to be its pawn. The officer didn't rush to judgment. He didn't rely on appearances. He relied on verification, on process, on truth. And that commitment, quiet and deliberate, was radical. In a world addicted to speed and spectacle, he chose depth. He chose clarity. He chose integrity. Karen's posture shifted. Her sunglasses came off. Her voice dropped. She began to plead, not with authority, but with desperation. She invoked misunderstandings, miscommunications, mistakes. But the officer didn't bend. He didn't scold. He simply documented. He wrote. He recorded. Because truth doesn't need theatrics. It needs evidence. And evidence, once gathered, becomes irreversible. The boot was declared illegal. The permit was exposed as fraudulent. And Karen, once the queen of the cul-de-sac, stood stripped, not of clothing, but of illusion. The officer didn't arrest her. He didn't humiliate her. He simply corrected the record. And that correction was more powerful than any punishment. Because when reality is restored, illusion dies quietly. I spoke to him afterward. I asked why he took it so seriously. He looked at me, eyes steady, and said, "Because if we don't, who will?" That sentence echoed through me. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about every system, every structure, every moment where truth is threatened by performance. The officer understood that his role wasn't just to enforce laws. It was to protect reality itself. And in that protection, he became something rare, a public servant who served truth, not power. He left without ceremony. No applause, no recognition. Just the quiet dignity of someone who had done his job, not for reward, but for principle. And I realized then, the most powerful people in our society are often the quietest, the ones who don't seek attention, but who hold the line, who say, "This isn't real," and make it stick. Karen would recover. She would find new ways to assert control. But the record was corrected. The truth was documented. And the neighborhood, whether it admitted it or not, had witnessed something profound. The collapse of illusion under the weight of reality. And the man who made it happen didn't shout. He verified. That day, I learned that truth doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it carries a pen. Sometimes it simply asks the right questions. And in those questions, reality is reborn. She wasn't born Karen. That name, weaponized, memed, flattened into a cultural shorthand, wasn't hers at birth. It was a mask she grew into, a role she rehearsed until it became indistinguishable from her skin. But on that day, in that parking lot, as the boot was removed and the permit declared a forgery, the mask cracked. And what emerged wasn't a villain, but something more tragic. A person who had built her entire identity on the scaffolding of control. Karen didn't just lose power. She lost herself. Because when your sense of self is constructed from illusion, truth is annihilation. She stood there, no longer issuing commands, no longer invoking codes. Her voice, once sharp and certain, had become a whisper, uncertain, searching, almost childlike. I was just trying to help, she said. And maybe she believed that. Maybe, in her mind, she was the last line of defense against chaos. Maybe she saw herself as a keeper of order, the guardian of standards. But that belief, however sincere, was built on a lie. And when the lie collapsed, so did she. Not physically, but existentially. Her posture sagged. Her eyes darted. She looked not at me, not at the officer, but at the houses, at the windows, at the people who had once nodded in approval. And they were gone. The audience had vanished. The stage was empty. And she was alone. There's a concept in philosophy, Heidegger's fallenness. The idea that we lose ourselves in roles, in routines, in the expectations of others. That we become inauthentic, not through malice, but through habit. Karen was fallen, not evil, not monstrous, just lost. She had mistaken authority for identity, control for meaning. And when that control was stripped away, she had nothing left. No foundation, no self, just a clipboard and a name that wasn't really hers. I felt no triumph, no vindication, only sorrow, because I saw in her reflection of something deeply human, the desperate need to matter, to be seen, to have impact. And in a world that often ignores, marginalizes, and silences, Karen had found a way to be heard, even if it was through fear, even if it was through fraud. She had carved out a space for herself in a system that didn't ask questions. And when the questions came, she unraveled. The neighborhood watched, but they didn't intervene. Not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. Because Karen's collapse wasn't just hers. It was theirs. She had been their proxy, their enforcer, their shield. And now, stripped of illusion, she revealed the fragility of the entire structure. If she could fall, so could they. If her authority was fake, what else had they believed that wasn't real? The collapse wasn't just personal. It was communal, philosophical, ontological. Karen tried to explain. She gestured to the permit, to the boot, to the rules. But the words no longer landed. They floated, untethered, meaningless. Because once truth enters a room, language must recalibrate. And her language was obsolete. She spoke in codes that no longer held power, in symbols that no longer signified. And in that semantic void, she became a ghost, visible, audible, but no longer real. I approached her, not to gloat, but to witness. To see her not as Karen, but as a person, a woman who had made choices. Some cruel, some desperate, all human. She looked at me, eyes wide, and said, "I didn't think it would go this far." And that sentence, simple, trembling, was the most honest thing she had said all day, because illusions always go further than we intend. They metastasize, they consume, and when they collapse, they take pieces of us with them. The officer handed her a citation, not for punishment, but for record, for history, for truth, and she took it with shaking hands, not because she feared the fine, but because she knew deep down that it was the first real document she had ever received. Not forged, not fabricated, just real. And in that reality, she was reborn, not as Karen, but as someone who could begin again. That day, I learned that identity is fragile. When we build ourselves on illusion, we risk annihilation. But I also learned that collapse is not the end. It's a beginning, a clearing, a reckoning. Karen's fall was not just a spectacle. It was a sermon, a warning, a mirror. And in that mirror, I saw myself, my neighbors, my society, all of us clinging to roles, to symbols, to illusions. All of us one question away from collapse.